right. Morning, everybody. I think that usually people have to kind of get over to the live. Good morning, and if you can hear us, okay, I will send something in the chat. But I think their participants are just building up again. They're in there, and then they have to get moved over to live as well.
They're moving over.
We're all kind of in some semi-state of not live until we go live, which is nice to know that we have that power. So hello, everyone. If you can hear me, say hello in the chat. Joanna and Christine, Bethany, Samantha. Thank you, everybody, for giving your first names. A lot of times I don't get that. Hi, Dr. Brosius. How are you? So glad to see you here. Lindsay's on. Hi, Lindsay. She's Study Pro, the other half here of me. Okay, well, Lindsay said hi. That's great. Thank you, Lindsay. At least we know somebody can hear us. That's great. We're about 3 minutes before 9, so we're going to give everybody a few minutes to get on, and most people are usually right on time. So we will continue chatting, and I was going to say that I was going to thinking this morning we should give a little shout out to Julie for introducing us.
Yes. Amazing. I was just driving behind her because I saw her Syracuse sticker in town.
Oh.
I was wondering how everything's going.
Oh, yes.
I feel like pandemic, like shit, like everything got shut down and then everything came in and like a fire hose. So I wonder if it's like settled.
I know. So now sometimes it's harder to keep in touch with everybody.
Oh, I know.
And so her first one in college, it's always a big deal, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exciting. You know, she went to Syracuse, so I think she was really excited.
Yes.
Her daughter was her alma mater. It's exciting.
Super excited. I don't know. I remember that when my son was 3 years old, my father called. You know, I'm from Ohio originally, and my father called, and my husband picked up, and he said, "So, David's going to Ohio State, right?" Which, of course, where he went, and my mom went, and I went, and my sister went. But my son did not go, actually. But we certainly hadn't thought about that when he was 3. I know that.
Yeah. My husband and I met at college. We went to Wisconsin. And so for me, I'm like, I don't think my daughter wants to live there, but maybe my son. I'm like, oh, I'd love to go back just to tour the campus again because it's so beautiful there. But I guess there's that sense of like, there's a little legacy, maybe action. We hope.
Yeah.
Like to see. Who knows?
That would be great. Well, I knew maybe not right from the start, but everyone who's been following along these webinars and hearing my son's story probably knows that a school that big was probably not the right choice for him. I'd still be looking for
there
him.
are these like you can make like for us we met we were in the honors program, and so for us it was like it takes this huge campus and it like boils it down to just this smallish group. Like it's still like hundreds of if not thousands of people, but you know, you can find your community, but it does take a lot of executive function to be able to navigate, you know, the campus, all the course offerings, just even like the logistics of, you know, I have one class over here and one class over here, and like
exactly
that's a 2-hour walk.
I think at 19 when he left, his executive was still looking for his function at the time. Much better now, but yeah. Every time I talk on the phone with someone at Study Pro, mom, and they're worried about their student and getting ready and being ready for college, I say it will happen. It's just you just have to. You're the one who has to be patient because those executive functions do come online.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning, everybody. We're happy to see everyone. I believe that everybody can hear us because I know Lindsay said hi, and if you want to say good morning on the chat, you can. And we're just going to kind of give it one more minute, but while everybody else is getting on, just if you want to see where the chat is so that you can also use that chat feature if you have any questions as we're moving along, that would be great. And what I will do is share the slides, which The first one really is that we'll start any moment, which is pretty much what we said. Good morning. Good morning, Dr. Brosius. Good morning, Anne. Good morning, Jamie. We're really glad you guys are here. Samantha, thank you for saying hello. Well, it's 9:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. Lauren and I, of course, have been chatting, and I will more formally introduce her in a minute, but my name is Debbie Rosen. Most of you know us or know me if you've been here before, but if you haven't, welcome. I am one of the owners of the Study Pro. The other one's behind the scenes, Lindsay Toms, and we have a very large group of folks that work here. And so we're super excited that you can be here today, which is the first of our monthly series that we've been having. This is our 7th year, Lauren. Oh my gosh, it's hard to believe. And when we first started, we did lunch and learns, and we literally had everybody here physically, and we had lunches, free lunches. So there is such a thing as a free lunch. And we invited everybody in and speakers, and it's one of our favorite things to do because as everyone here will experience today, we get incredible folks like yourself that can come and share. And one of the things I was so excited about when meeting you is that I've had an experience, as you know, because we had a chance to chat about it with my dad, who was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment a couple years ago and is kind of struggling and realizing kind of the circle of life around executive functions. And, you know, we certainly represent kind of the beginnings of that with folks or kids that are in fourth grade through college, and you're kind of representing the adult side. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But for those of you who don't know the Study Pro, we are an executive function and study skills center. And so a lot of things that Lauren will be talking about today are really near and dear to our heart. And it's hard to build these skills, but there are ways to build these skills. And, you know, we always say that underdeveloped executive functions, and when we're thinking about kids that have curriculums that might be more challenging than what they can manage from an executive function perspective, are really about identifying what the barriers are, where the friction is, and then how can we help build strategies. And so these are the types of things that we work on with kids. And I know you're going to be talking about that today. And one of the things that we've recently even expanded beyond where we were last year was our writing coaching, because writing is so executive function dependent, right? And the whole process piece of writing, getting started and organizing your thoughts and not feeling, you know, managing that feeling of overwhelm. And so that's something that has become more and more important to us. And as such, one of the things that we're doing this year, earlier in the year, because it was so successful last year, was we're launching I should say, this year, a couple of our writing workshops, which is here on the left. These are not online yet, but we're about to put them online, but I thought we would throw the dates out here since all of you are here. We do have a middle school date on October 22nd and high school on November 5th. These are all free. That's another aspect of what we do, a lot of free workshops. So our writing coaches will be participating, as will Lindsay and I, in strategies to how to get unstuck in our writing. And then we have 2 other webinars scheduled. We will have a November one as well, but I'm super excited about Dr. Navidi, who's here for the first time in October on the 7th. And he will talk about the mind-gut connection. And there is such an incredibly strong connection between everything in our brain and our body. If you've ever had the pleasure of watching your child learn to drive, when you're pushing on the brakes because you're so freaked out about it, you know what the connection is between your brain and your body. And so he'll be talking about that. And Dr. Ed Spector, who was here way early on in our, I think he was the 14th speaker that we had, but he is really renowned, an expert on technology addiction. And we're going to be talking a little bit about, you know, all kinds of things in the screens, how much is too much, not just that aspect. So we hope that you can put that on your calendar, and we'll of course send information out. So that's all about us. And I'm going to, Lauren, sharing so that you can go ahead and share your slides while I introduce you. And as I mentioned earlier on, for those who were here a little bit early, I had the pleasure of being introduced to Lauren through a mutual friend and someone who we very much appreciates kind of Lauren's work, and I have come to as well. And of course, she is a seasoned clinician in private practice working with adults that are experiencing cognitive communications or communicative disorders. And it's really everything that impairs our brain that it might be like brain injury or like a concussion or mild cognitive impairment, as I mentioned, ADHD, and she'll talk more about that. But really, anything that impacts the interconnection of thinking and communication. And so it's really great to see someone who is as passionate of a speaker and advocate about all things related to brain health, as we are certainly around improvement of executive function. And of course, as she'll talk about today, executive function is a huge piece of attention and what she's going to talk about. So I'd like to welcome you, Lauren. I know your 21 years of working in hospitals and acute rehab centers has really defined your and shaped your experience and your passion for helping adults. So we're so excited to have you here today. And I'm going to put myself on mute, but I want everyone to know that please, Lauren's open to answering questions in the chat. And if we don't answer them, there's not a perfectly appropriate time for me to interrupt you, Lauren. I do jot them down and save them. So you guys feel free to put things in the chat. And Lauren has also agreed that if we need to stay a little bit, a couple of minutes late, we can do that and continue answering questions. So thank you for being our first guest this year. We appreciate you being here.
Oh, I'm so excited. Passionate's probably a word that gets used a lot. I just get so excited in talking about the brain and thinking. And in addition to being a clinician, I'm also a parent. I have 2 kids in the McLean schools. And so a lot of the things that I do professionally, I think find their way into my approach to, being with my children, watching my children. And so I think a lot of this is, like you had said, Debbie, it's really the lifespan, right? I think thinking about your thinking is a very high level skill. And I think it's something that is, we can all get started on ourselves wherever we are, to make things better. And so I'm really excited to be here. Thank you guys for taking the time on your busy morning, because I know we're all very busy, to learn a little bit today. So like Debbie said, I was in the hospital system for 20 years, and like a lot of people in pandemic, I decided to shake it up a little bit. And so now I started my own private practice, and I do focus on working with clients who've had some sort of neurologic injury. I'm starting to see some clients with ADHD as adults, which is really fascinating. And one of the things I think is really unique for women in particular, who are sort of maybe had that diagnosis, maybe it wasn't even diagnosed. And then life changes and things transition, and starting to experience some deficits. And so that's another population I get really excited about helping and supporting, really looking at how can we make things better and easier, make you feel better so that you can continue to participate in all the things that bring you joy. So that's a little bit about me. So today we're going to talk about attention, which is right off the bat, like it's a big thing. It's super complicated. But I have a few things I think you'll be able to take away today. One is to know how some of the important brain structures that we think about when we think about attention. And so I'll give a very teaspoon sized neuroscience talk. We're going to talk about the types of attention, because just like memory, attention is something that actually has many different components. And I think that will really help us to understand sort of a little bit about what we see when we see in ourselves or we see in someone else, breakdowns in attention, but also successful attention. We're going to talk about attention and cognition to be a portion of a bigger skill, which is our thinking skill. So kind of look at how those are all interrelated. And then most important, we're going to spend most of our time talking about how to protect attention as a resource, because I'm sure if you are listening today, it's something that you can recognize is vulnerable. And when we're not paying attention, or our students aren't paying attention, there are consequences to that. So really looking at what are some of the best practices, what does some of the brain science say about what we can do to protect our attention. So that's kind of how we're going to shape today's talk. So attention in the brain. So this is, again, a real quick overview for those of you who maybe had some education on the anatomy of the body at some point. But we have this brain in our heads. It's, I think, our most important organ. It has two sides. It has a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, and each hemisphere has four lobes. So there's the frontal lobe, which we're going to talk about mostly. We've got the parietal lobe, which kind of sits on top, the temporal lobe, which is sort of on the sides, and the occipital lobe, which is in the back. And then we've got the cerebellum and the brainstem underneath. The frontal lobe, though, is really the main player when it comes to attention and higher level thinking skills. It is absolutely the largest lobe in the brain. It's pretty significantly a good chunk of the brain space that we have, and the energy that the brain uses. A lot of it is consumed by the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is really has a lot of important connections. So I think back in the day when people were trying to figure out how to map the brain, it was sort of like, well, this spot has this job and this spot has this job, and it's absolutely not true anymore. There's a lot of networks and there's a lot of connections. There's feedback loops and there's feed forward loops. And I think in this case, the frontal lobe has a lot of important connections to not just the sort of regions on the outside of the brain, the cortex, but the subcortical structures, in particular, the limbic system, which helps us to manage emotions. Our frontal lobe is really kind of in charge of noticing, feeling, and then regulating, which is a really big thing. So, important connections that the frontal lobe has. The frontal lobe truly is the executive function command center. So, when we look at the skills that we expect to see in ourselves, when we look at the skills that we want to see in our students, this is really the part of the brain that we're hoping to observe growing and thriving. But, and this to me is so interesting because for the longest time I knew it takes a long time for the frontal lobe to like fully bake, right? For it to fully have all of the connections, all of the neurons functioning, and all of those skills we expect to see as a result. And it had been the late 20s, and now I just looked at a recent paper. It's actually not until the 30s that we see full development of the frontal lobes. And so I think that helps me to really manage my expectations when I look at someone. And a lot of times, I might have been working at the hospital with high school students or college students who maybe had a car accident or a concussion. And to say, what is realistic for me to expect from this brain? And now I sort of recognize we should keep this in mind when we're looking at expectations. Not to say that we have to wait until people are in their 30s for executive function, but we do want to be able to say, is this person's brain capable of what I'm asking them to do? And this is, one of the reasons why we want to have a little bit more patience and tolerance and understanding. Like I mentioned, the way the brain works is there's a lot of systems of attention. And in the case of there's attention networks, there's sort of a default attention network. And there are these two networks that I want to just mention. The dorsal network and the ventral network. And it's sort of like it's the direction. But the dorsal network is the concept of like a top down approach. So I'm sort of seeing the big picture and then I'm kind of looking down, filtering down to look at the components. This is important for sort of attention to spatial locations. I'm sort of in a space and I'm sort of noticing maybe details about the space. And then the ventral network is something that looks at detecting unexpected stimuli or something that comes in. So our different networks have sort of different responsibilities. I think of this a lot as like a forest or the trees, right? So we use different types of attention, back and forth, really simultaneously in some ways to be able to perceive and notice things around us. And there's different networks that have sort of different specialties. So when I was working in the hospital, I had clients who had a right hemisphere stroke. Those folks, because of the damage to their networks in their attention system, are maybe super hyper focused on a detail, but are actually missing a good amount of spatial information. And so the brain is coming up with all of these sort of interesting conclusions. And that was a real, sort of allowed me to really be able to see just the difference between these two networks kind of being off balance. And then, of course, we can't talk about the brain and attention without talking about neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are chemical messengers. They are molecules whose whole job is to carry this chemical signal from one neuron to the next neuron. So again, this is super simple, but this is something that's really important because the frontal lobe in particular is a major user of dopamine. So some of the chemicals that we might be hearing about, if you know someone who's maybe taking a medication that helps with attention, this is really where we're at. We're looking at helping the brain to have the right transmitters so that the messages can be sent as they are needed. Dopamine is that feel good hormone. It is a big player in the reward system, which is another responsibility of the frontal lobe. So when we're doing well at something and it makes us feel good, our brain rewards us with this dopamine so that we can continue to do that thing. It's really big in survival, but it's also key to motivation and emotional regulation and thinking skills. So dopamine and norepinephrine are big chemicals that we want to have available for the brain. And I think actually in ADHD brains, it's sort of this biological difference that they don't necessarily have access or the production of the dopamine. And so some of it is chemical and some of it is just sort of behavioral, people trying to make sure their brains have enough of the novelty and the stimulation that their brains need to be able to be successful. And then glutamate and GABA being sort of another role of the neurotransmitters having this capacity to turn things on or to turn things off. So this is something that the pharmacology really speaks to. So that's sort of the brain background of attention. So let's talk about what attention means. You know, when you say to your kid, pay attention, what are we actually looking for, right? Like, what is attention? And this is something that I'm going to speak to in particular because I come from a rehabilitation background. I'm going to look at some rehabilitation research. And McKay Sahlberg is one of those like guru researchers I really enjoy, who really looks at cognition and communication. And these two have created this clinical attention framework. So they look at attention primarily in people who have had a brain injury, but there'll be a lot of sort of theoretical and clinical frameworks of attention that you can find if you're interested in this type of thing. This one really speaks to me because I think it sort of makes sense when I look at my own attention skills or the attention skills of others. These terms are really something that I like looking at. These folks created a task. It's a test called the attention processing. It's actually a training that people can do. It's something that you'd see in the clinical space. And they actually reevaluated this attention model. So I'm going to share something with you that's I think, very interesting for many of us because we rely on it so heavily. But the first thing that we want to talk about is sustained attention. So sustained attention is what it sounds like, which is the ability to maintain attention during continuous and repetitive activities, right? So just your ability to sit here, to listen, not get up and wander around or to be doing something completely different. It's just sort of like going the distance, right? That's sustained attention. And I think that's probably what we all think of when we say pay attention, right? We're looking at someone's just a capacity to lock in and to be present. It's sort of the foundation. It's kind of, this is a hierarchy of sorts, and this is sort of that lowest level. The next level, though, requires some executive control. So, like right off the bat, we're getting into the brain's ability to kind of regulate attention. So, the next level in this hierarchy is called executive control working memory. And this is working memory is the ability to hold on and manipulate information in our mind, right? This is allowing us to integrate new information with existing information. And it allows someone to retrieve information from long-term memory in order to utilize it. So, for example, like recalling a password and entering it into a website is actually a feature of working memory. The ability to hold on to something I've said to jot it down. There's this like temporary scratch pad. And so that's a form of attention. It's called working memory, but it's in this attention model, which I think just shows how interconnected everything is. So the next level beyond that is what we call selective attention. This is something that I think we're all sort of experienced in noticing when we do it well and when it doesn't work well, which is the ability to selectively focus on information and rule out or filter out distractions. So if you're in a restaurant and you're talking to a friend, you really want to focus on what they're saying. You're not necessarily paying attention to everything else around you. We might notice something, but we haven't dropped our friend's conversation altogether because we're really selectively focused on that. The next level would be executive control suppression. So suppression is our ability to control impulsive responding. So it's not blurting out an idea every time I have it. It's the ability to think of something, to hold on to it, and then bring it to the bring it out when it's appropriate to do so. So some of the turn taking that we do, some of the ability to be able to hold on to information and then know and read when it's appropriate to share it. And again, these are all attention, but we don't necessarily think of this as attention. And I think it's because there is this interplay between executive control. And then finally, alternating attention. This is sort of the most complex form. This is the ability to shift, sometimes very rapidly, between activities that we're doing sort of simultaneously. So, talking on the phone and cooking is a good example. This is what they are saying is at the top of the hierarchy. What I think is really interesting, and what used to be there and is no longer there, is divided attention. So, how many of us really love our multitasking ways, right? We really want to be the person who's able to, send an email and be talking to a coworker and be thinking about what we're going to make for dinner or when we have to pick up our kids. It's this idea that we can juggle and do these things all simultaneously. What I thought was really interesting when I went to go look at this clinical model is they've actually removed divided attention. And I think it's probably controversial, but it's this idea that we're not actually sort of evenly distributing our attention systems. We're going back and forth, and we're going back and forth very rapidly. So for a lot of my folks, who I just had a client right now who's had she was in a car accident. She has a mild brain injury. She's working and she's like grieving this multitasker that she was. And so I tried to kind of help her to understand that that's actually something that's not necessarily what your brain's best at doing. And the reason why, so multitasking, divided attention isn't so much a thing. But the reason why is there's these what's called a switching cost. So it's this idea that when we go back and forth between two things, even though we're not conscious of it necessarily, we have to make a decision. What am I doing and how do I do it? Because the brain has a different process, right? If I'm trying to write a clinical note and I'm trying to help my son with his homework, those are two different skills I have to do. That's different information I'm thinking about. I might be writing one and talking to another. And every time we make that switch back and forth, there's a potential decrease in our efficiency or our capacity. So the switching cost is something you have to think about. Is this something that I'm willing to pay a price in? Usually I try to do my clinical notes when I don't have any distractions because I don't want that to be compromised. I don't want spelling mistakes. I don't want details missed. So it's sort of like we have to think about this prioritization and not just have this default assumption that we're doing all of these things as well as we think we are. So that's a sort of an argument for the single tasking or the monotasking lifestyle, which is easier said than done. Okay, so let's think about attention in the framework of other cognitive skills. So I'm a big analogy user because I think this stuff gets kind of complicated. And so I love the analogy of a building. So when we have a structure like this, and we live in McLean or we're near McLean or we've seen McLean, it's construction everywhere, right? It's this idea that we go from the bottom to the top. And our foundation of our building is attention. And so if we have expectations of higher level skills, like some of these skills, maybe processing, problem solving, reasoning, showing good judgment, if there are cracks in my foundation, I'm not going to have the higher level skills all set to go. This is something that I encountered in the hospital a lot. I would have a client or a patient who was really struggling with attention. And, the nursing team or the family members would be like, why isn't he pushing the call bell when he needs help? Why did he just get up and get out of bed? And so we have to say, well, where was his attention? Is it that he was, distracted by something? Was he, what was he, did he know where the call bell was? Did he know, was he able to self-monitor? So these are things that are absolutely sort of, I think, necessary to layer up. And so it reinforces, if anything, the reason why I love attention so much is because when I attend to something, I'm then able to process it. My brain can make sense of it, right? I'm then able to work on the memory process. So it kind of is layered in a way of complexity. And of course, we know that executive functions kind of govern all the way back down again to attention. So this is very much something that we sort of look at, certainly clinically. I'm looking at attention and building up. I'm also looking at, from a learning standpoint, and this is something when we think about our students, I can't expect someone to remember something if they didn't pay attention to it in the first place, right? How much does this happen at home? My husband will say, I told you, baseball practice is at Dulles Field. And I'll say, no, you didn't tell me that. Well, I probably wasn't paying attention, right? So it's this idea that we really do have to be clued in, and we have to think about, did I process what you said? Well, I probably processed it, but I definitely didn't process it if I wasn't paying attention. This is really also about sensory input too. As someone who works with adults, I'm thinking about, how is the vision? How is the hearing? What are the inputs that we're really looking at? And how is not only what are we able to process, but maybe what's distracting us? In this case, one of the things that's really essential to brain health is that there's some research that's just come out to talk about the impact of when people have untreated hearing loss or untreated vision impairment. The brain stops receiving the signals that it needs to be able to utilize. And that's actually some of the sort of dementia prevention work is going on, is really looking at how can we make hearing aids accessible to people. And so you probably heard the FDA has just approved like over the counter hearing aids to try to increase access because they are so expensive. But really, attention does start with sensory input. And so if you have someone who is struggling with sensory input, whether it's hypersensitive or there's just not enough signal coming in, that's another sort of foundation. Like, let's get to the core and build up those skills. One of the things that is so important is really understanding executive function in all of this. And so there's 8 executive functions. I'll just click over to the next slide. This is the Study Pro uses the brief, which is a behavior rating inventory of executive control. I have a few more that I'll share that I think are in addition to this. But when we look at executive function, it's a big part of sort of, again, understanding attention and understanding how attention plays in. So we'll just kind of go through these. Inhibition is obviously that resisting or delaying an impulse, right? We talked about suppression as a form of attention, right? Initiation, getting started, shifting, right? That alternating attention, being able to go back and forth to things, the emotional control, working memory, again, isn't that an attention form, right? The ability to hold on information, to manipulate it, planning, which is anticipating things, setting those goals, developing those steps, organizing, and self monitoring, right? So these are the ones that Debbie shared with me that are really kind of core to the Study of Pro's way of being. I have a few more that I think are important. Is processing speed. So this is consciously deciding how quickly or how slowly to perform a task. Sometimes it's very intentional or deliberate, where I might say, how quickly am I reading this piece of paper? Do I just need to get like, the overview, or do I really need to dig in and process it at a deeper level? So to a certain extent, this is an automatic thing, but sometimes we also do exert some more volitional control. Sustained and selective attention is sometimes also considered an executive function skill. That's the ability to kind of hang in there, to suppress attention to what we call sort of that filter and focus. So the ability to get everything out and then be able to drill down on what's most relevant. And for me, one of the biggest ones I think is important to recognize is goal-directed persistence, which is the ability to continue the effort even when the task is difficult or boring. As an executive function skill, that's so important because school is not easy, work is not easy, but we have to continue because we know that there's a benefit. We know that there's a reward for finishing an assignment on time or paying a bill that allows you to stay, in your house or with lights on, right? The goal directed persistence is something that's super relevant. Okay. So we went over the brain, we went over attention, what it is. We talked about attention in the scheme of cognition. Now, what I really want to focus on is what do we need to know about protecting attention? Because I think this is something that's super essential for all of us. So most of the time, we'll be spending kind of going over some of the best practices, I think, in attention.
Lauren,
And yeah,
I'm just going to interrupt you for 1 second
yeah,
because there was a question that might be good at this like break
yeah,
time
yeah,
if
yeah.
you wanted to go. I don't know if you want to go back a slide, but there was a question about have there been any studies on sensory input of children since the invention of the iPhone?
I am sure there have been, because I know that there's a lot of information that's talking about sort of the cognitive skills that are changing as a result of just technology in general. I think when we look at a brain's ability to shift, to process rapidly shifting visual information, I'm sure there's that information, and I can try to find it and try to send some over if you're interested. I think this is ongoing. I think a lot of the things that, if you look at the iPhone technology, and we'll talk about this in a moment, when you look at some of the newer features, things like focus, right? Settings that basically tell the phone to stop bothering you, I am sure that that is related to sensory changes or trying to really promote distraction. But I don't have the studies off the top of my head. But I think it's a smart question to ask, because I think we have to make a choice, right? In a lot of cases, and I know you're going to have someone talking about screen time, so this is probably a great webinar for us all to join. But it's this idea that, our brains are going to change because of the stimuli around us. And for a long time, that was probably deemed very helpful, right? Sort of, we had computers that could allow us to have industries that would thrive and grow. And now we're really getting to a point where it is so much that we may be seeing changes in our capacity to really sustain a long-standing effort. And I think that that's something that our culture values, right? We don't necessarily like this, like, mosquito, fly, sort of like going all over the place. And yet, that's sort of the system that our children are growing up in, and their brains are going to respond to the stimuli just like we responded to stimuli growing up. So I think this is something that's a really smart question to ask, and to try to think about, how has this changed? And if that's a motivator for you to either expose your children to technology or to restrain that, I think that knowing there is a brain development change happening sort of widely culturally, I think is important to know. And that kind of goes to the first point here, right? Is just talking about attention and thinking skills as a resource. I think that in a lot of ways, thinking about thinking, and I said this initially, is challenging. I think it's challenging for adults that I work with, where we're suddenly starting to point things out and they'll notice it and they can understand it, but they haven't really been thinking about it or appreciating it. And this is even folks who, haven't had a significant brain injury. But it's just this idea that attention is really important. And so we're going to start to talk about it. We're going to use the term attention. I have to say, like, just yesterday, my daughter was working. She's a sophomore at McLean High School. She was FaceTiming with a friend while they were working on an assignment. And I heard her say, I need to get off the FaceTime. I need to focus. And I was like, oh, my darling baby. Of course, then she turned on something else, some other screen, and continued to do her homework. And I was like, oh, wrong. But she at least is sort of, this is something where you have to talk about. This is a resource, and it's not infinite. And I think that's something that's really important, is to recognize, if we have attention, is it just an never ending stream of highest quality? And the answer is no. So what we really have to figure out is, where is my attention right now? Do I have enough attention to be able to do what I need to do in the moment? And if I don't, what do I do about it? Right. So just sort of understanding and recognizing attention as a really important skill. And most importantly, I think for people who have students, or who are teachers or parents, or even if we're just with somebody else at work, we need to learn how to model attentive behavior. So attentive behavior, I'm sure we all know someone who's very distracted, who looks distracted, who may be looking at their phone or their iWatch, and they're just like, every stimuli comes in and that's where their attention goes. That individual, to me, is very distracted. And so I don't have the faith in that they are processing what I'm saying, or they're able to do what I'm asking them to do, because I can see that they're distractions. And so the opposite is to model attentive behavior. And then I think also to understand what that looks like. The caveat here is that I think we are living in an epically disastrous time for attention. There are so many distractions. It's almost as if we're set up to fail, quite honestly. I mean, when you think about working from home, teleworking, the pandemic, current events, we have all sorts of social media. We have technology that is giving us all of this, depending on what your notifications are like on your phone. Big, heavy worries that I think are things that can be enormously distracting. And then there's just sort of like your, Northern Virginia parenting of just like constant appointments and sports. And, there's just always stuff to watch on Netflix, and it's always available and you can binge. And it's just as if it's a tsunami of things to attend to. And there is, I think, a certain expectation that we're sort of like up on the latest. And I think that that's sort of a societal expectation that we are constantly looking for the newest thing. And I think some of that, when we talked about sort of the studies on sensory input, I think a lot of the social media in particular, even if you go back to like CNN and the breaking headlines, right? Every time I turn on CNN, there's always breaking news, right? Well, it's this idea that really smart people have marketed news or current events through social media to really be hitting the dopamine, the sense of, oh my gosh, something is happening. If I hang in here for a few minutes, I'm going to get something else. It's why we refresh Twitter. It's just like the technology companies have really leveraged what's happening in the frontal lobe. And so I want to just say that I think all the things we're going to talk about now in terms of protecting attention, you are in a fight for, it is feeling a little bit of a battle just because it takes a lot of intention and work to be able to um, recognize and manage the things that take our attention away, because I think they're ubiquitous. So the first thing I always look at is, what are we doing about our daily routine, right? And the idea that sleep is so restorative for brain function, including attention. I think that there's a lot of sort of bedtime procrastination that can happen because we are working so much and our days go so long that we kind of delay going to bed and getting sleep because there's something to watch, or there's something to look at, or there's stuff to read. And so I think that sleep, unfortunately, becomes something that we sort of push to the background. But as someone who specializes in working with brain health and brain injury, I really want to emphasize how incredible sleep is. And having a family routine and a personal routine that values sleep and that creates opportunities to disconnect from technology and really devote time to preparing your body for sleep and then actually sleeping, that's actually enormously important. And so I really just want to put a plug in for sleep and sleep hygiene. And if you need more information on what that looks like, I have lots of resources. Healthy diet. In a lot of ways, we think about diet for health reasons, and attention and brain are absolutely essential. Your brain utilizes glucose. That's the energy source that it needs. It's the only energy source the brain can access and utilize effectively. And so, really making sure that you and your student, especially in times of focus, have those good energy sources in the body is one way that we sort of look at securing attention. You can think of those, junk food snacks and sugary things that sort of burn quick and are done and leave us feeling depleted. And this is also another opportunity, I think, to promote and to teach attentive behaviors, also to say, like, I'm about to sit down and focus on something. I'm going to give myself some healthy snacks. This is something that I think just reinforces the need to maintain good fruits, good vegetables, complex carbohydrates, the things that are good for, by the way, your brain, the blood flow in your brain. If it's good for your heart, it's good for your brain. Just from a brain health maintenance standpoint, we really want to look at nutrition. And I think when we are distracted, and there's actually a big correlation between ADHD and eating challenges. So people who are maybe not planning to eat or eating at off hours, or there's sort of nutritionists who specialize in this, can really give convincing arguments as to why we have to really work to eat well in order to maintain a healthy brain, especially when it's hard for us to do so. We want to aim for daily activity, especially before focus time. Debbie was just sharing that exercise is something she really values, which I was applauding because I think that's wonderful. But the idea that, again, thinking about brain health, oxygenated blood flow is awesome for the brain. And there's a lot of, I think, research that looks at having an opportunity to get up, to take a walk, either before you're working or as a brain break, right? So this concept that, and we'll talk about this in a moment, these strategies we utilize to really be able to maintain our attention is actually stopping work and getting up and even just moving your body, taking a quick walk, doing some stretches. the idea that your body's physical activity will directly correlate to positive brain health and attention, I think is really well established by the research. And so it is something I think where, if your kid comes home and takes the bus and then just sits, and then you're asking them to dedicate some time to a homework or something they need to focus on, and it's hard for them, it may be that we kind of have an opportunity to run around in the backyard or even just do some household activities where we're moving, we're carrying laundry up and down the stairs. Just that being something that, in addition to being a good life skill, can allow this person to move before we're asking them to sit down and really focus on something. Time limits. So I think the study pro uses, and I utilize in my therapies, time timers. It's this idea that I want to focus my attention, but I am going to kind of budget it for a certain period of time, and then I'm going to give myself a brain break because I know that just sitting down and working for 4 hours, my brain actually doesn't maintain the same quality of attention. So really understanding sort of the how to set limits on what you're expecting of your brain in terms of sustained attention. But really, when we talk about time limits, I'm thinking about technology. I'm thinking about putting a cap on how much time my kids have on certain apps. And, really saying when it's done, it's done. And that's part of that self monitoring, self regulation that I think we do need to exert control over because our children do not have the capacity necessarily to draw the line, right? To say enough is enough. And when we talk about things like social media, YouTube, again, there is no, the chapter's over, the book is closed, it's done. There's a constant stream of information. And so really, we really do have to exert control. So app limits, focus time, even saying, at 9 o'clock, the phones are done, they're plugged in the kitchen, they're charging, you don't have access to it. That is something that I think is very hard for us to do as adults. It is really essential to be able to limit this. And I'm sure the speaker who's going to be talking about screen time will probably have a similar message. But I think this is one of the big ways that I see my clients, and honestly people in my family, just being their attention gets hijacked by the technology that they're looking at because there is no cutoff, there's no sharp delineation between when you're focusing on it and when it's done. And so we have to take advantage of some of the things that are getting built in. And then teach self-monitoring skills. We just talked about the fact that the frontal lobe's executive functions are not all done until people are in their 30s. And so I think kids are different. Adults are different. Some people are really good at self-monitoring and some people just aren't. And so we have to just respect that. I have 2 kids. My daughter's like executive function superstar, right? She does a lot of this stuff. My son, not so much. So it's just sort of knowing what do we need to teach this person that's really going to help them to be their best. I think I like to start with catching them being really focused. So when my son is playing Legos and he's really, excited and he's searching and he's scanning and he's finding things and he's assembling some amazing scene, I don't comment necessarily on the product. Of course, some medieval scene is really impressive, but I say, wow, you were so focused. Really had your attention. You were working really hard. So I think it's important that we recognize when we do catch kids being really focused and locked in, and they know then what that feels like. Because again, it's about, oh, mom noticed I was really focused. What was I doing? Right? What did that feel like? Same thing when you say, hey, you know what? You have 3 things going at the same time. How focused do you feel on the content you're trying to read? So we may have to kind of say, check in with yourself. Are you feeling focused right now? I see you bouncing all over the house. What's happening? So being able to sort of look at not themselves, their qualities, but look at their behaviors and help them to start to understand. That's important. I'll do that too with sleep. If I know someone got a bad night's sleep, I'll say, oh my gosh, I can tell how sleepy you are. You seem like you're really kind of foggy today. Or if they've had like an overindulged, junk food fast at a friend's house, they're feeling, ugh, I'll be like, man, that food's really speaking to you, isn't it? I think we need to help kids understand, the consequences of some of the things that they're doing, both good and not so good. So this is really to me about teaching self-monitoring skills. And I'll do the same for myself. I will say I'm really not focused on getting so distracted, and they will see me put my phone away and they'll see me go and close the door. I'm someone who struggles with reading when there's noise. I It doesn't take much. I just can't focus. And so I'll say, I'm trying to read this book. I have in my earbuds. I cannot hear you. So this is how I'm focusing. Please tap me on the shoulder if you need me. That's just modeling sort of how we manage our attention. And so I think teaching it and showing it are really important. That goes to internal distractions and external distractions. So this is a big part of what I do when I'm looking at trying to reinforce attention, is starting to really draw people's focus on what are they prone to. So external distractions would be what's in my environment. Again, we talked about sensory, right? So if attention is primarily relying on sensory input, the environment could be overstimulating, right? So what is distracting me, or what is distracting my student? Is it the ambient activity? Do we maybe need to put them sort of facing away from the kitchen or the siblings or whatever, so that they can really focus? Are they like me, where noises are just something that, really draws their attention away? Is it, are they not seated in a comfortable space, or is there, cooking is happening and they're sort of getting distracted by that? So really knowing and paying attention to what's around you and your environment. And this is really where we have to look at, again, the technology, or, what tends to, drive us crazy, what's taking us and hijacking our attention from what we want to focus on. And then we talk about internal distractions. And this is something that really happens a lot with my clientele, but I also imagine is really happening, especially now in what is, I think, really being deemed sort of a mental health crisis in our adolescents and our teens, and adults, frankly, as a result of pandemic, social media, like you pick the thing. There's a lot of internal distractions. What I notice a lot with my clients is when I'm asking them to focus and they're thinking, they're really utilizing their thinking skills. What will oftentimes come to play are thoughts or worries or concerns, especially adults who are sort of used to functioning a certain way, have had a change. A lot of what distracts us are those internal distractors. Internal distractors could also be hunger. I could be cold. If something's inside and how I'm feeling, I mean, certainly that's kind of one of those, both internal, external. But what we really want to target is this internal distraction. And so I just discovered, and just sort of plowed through, um, Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett. I'm looking around my office because it's like literally somewhere here. A fantastic book. Actually, one of my concussion clients recommended it to me. I'm sure you've seen it. This guy is a Yale professor who does a lot of the social emotional learning work at Yale, and is a great speaker and has all sorts of good media out there. So you can check him out. But he has this acronym called RULER. And I was thrilled to find this because I'm applying it literally everywhere. I've given it to my clients, I'm giving it to my children. I need my husband to look at it. And it's this concept of recognizing emotion, understanding the why, labeling that emotion, expressing that emotion, and learning how to regulate. And if this doesn't say executive function, I don't know what does, right? So this is about attention and executive function, to be able to understand what we're feeling. And in this case, for attention, is we really want to be able to have kids learn how to pay attention to their feelings, right? Understand why they might be feeling that way, give them the language to be able to express it, not only labeling it, but being able to express that emotion. And also, really key for me is regulating the emotion. So when I have an adult client who is worried about cognition, or worried about perceptions at work, or is worried about, whatever, we just spend some time to start to talk about it, to label it, because once we can name it, we can tame it, right? We can really help to take that distraction away so that we're able to focus. And they come with this really cool mood meter. You can Google this. I just found this online. But it's essentially looking at, again, giving kids a word. Because what does your kid say when your student comes home? How are you feeling? Fine. I'm good. Those words are not on here, because there is a rich vocabulary that can really help kids to kind of clue into what they're feeling. High energy, low energy, pleasant, unpleasant. I love this as a tool. It makes something that I think feels like super nebulous and hard to pin down a lot more concrete. And again, This would be useful if you're not talking about attention, but I certainly think it promotes attention to something that's very important. And it also can be utilized to kind of manage inattention, really helping our students to understand what they're feeling. I'm super excited about it. So, some of the questions that they talk about in the book are, how are you feeling? I'm actually starting out a lot of my sessions this way. How are you feeling? It just really invites some good description. Again, with our students, what might have happened to cause this feeling? My son had some bullying going on last year. It was really hard. And we had to ask those questions to be able to understand the scenarios that were really making him feel kind of, bad and rejected. What do you need right now? And what can I do to support you? I think we can ask this probably of anybody. But in this case, when we're asking someone to focus and we pinpoint that there's an internal distraction, this is how we regulate and how we manage, versus just saying, like, oh, you're fine, or keep working. I think that this is an important part of helping someone to be able to maintain focus.
Lauren, we did have a comment that before you go
Yes.
on, that from Megan, who I believe is the school nurse from the previous previous text, but saying regulating seems to be the hardest part of the whole situation. As a primary school nurse, there are times even as a registered nurse that I do not know how to help with that. And certainly we do know that if we can't get past that emotion, right, there's hard to get to the skills. And we see that, we definitely see that as well. So I don't know if you have any comments for her. I know you talked about some ideas to regulate by validating is one of the things you were talking about, right? Validating the emotions rather than trying to fix it, and listening and helping them name it so that they can tame it. I do think that and someone else, Carolyn Hope, mentioned that their LCSW her son used the mood meter app several years ago to start to learn to name his emotions. It was awesome. And one of the things that Dr. Beckett said when we saw him speak was, we have a very hard time noticing and describing those emotions because we can't effectively share what our emotion really is. And by using that chart, if you want to go back there for 1 second,
Yeah.
then you actually see that it's helpful for kids to expand their vocabulary of what their emotions are. And I know that as parents, and I had the opportunity to see him speak. I believe it was at one of maybe the FCPS conferences or one of the, I know, educational conferences he spoke, and he's absolutely phenomenal. But what's great is that you can look at your pleasantness level and you can look at your energy level, and it again already just by looking at that reframes right how we think about how we feel. And I think this can be printed out, and we'll definitely send this when we Kelly, yes, send this access to the slides, and when we send the link to the book. But just by printing it out and kind of talking to kids about it, you can get probably more from them than good, because good doesn't show up on here, if I remember correctly.
Right.
And it does help. I know even myself, it's helped me to think when I was going through a particularly tough time, how am I feeling? How am I really feeling? And some of the things you said before were so important about stopping and noticing. And I think that's really such an important piece, just to stop and notice, oh, I am feeling distracted, because until you notice that, you really can't do anything about it.
Absolutely. Like, it's awareness first and foremost. I think also what's really important is to recognize that we need to feel the feelings. Like, it's okay to have uncomfortable feelings. It's okay to be feeling tense or nervous or restless or angry. Like, these are things that we don't just say, like, don't feel that way, right? It's okay to feel the feelings. The question is, what can we do to feel a little bit better if it's not feeling good? So, again, my client who I just spoke to has a very high level job, and she's feeling, she uses a lot of words like anxious, right? So, of course, I'm thinking my mental health professional colleagues are going to hopefully help us to kind of tackle this. But she'll also say, I'm feeling unsupported, or I feel, She has a lot, she struggles with sort of her value. And so just to be able to say that and to say, well, why do you think you feel that way? And then she's telling me this is some, these are not necessarily new. And we'll say, right. So they're not always new, but they haven't always been this bad. What do you want to try to do about them? What have you used in the past that's successful? So this really allows us, like you said, to pay attention to this, to notice this. I think it's also important that we allow students to feel the feelings, right? It's okay to feel disappointed. You know, your baseball team lost 20-0. That's hard. I understand you're disappointed. I'm not coming in to fix that, because you know what? We all have to feel disappointed. The question is, what can I do to make you feel better? You know, if I have someone who's disappointed for days on end, that's a different situation than I'm disappointed from the car ride from the baseball field to our house and then I'm, you know, distracted. But it's this idea that when we're able to say it and to say it, you know, help our children to say it, I think we can then come in, validate, and then say, well, what's going to make you feel better right now? You know, or is this a situation where we actually need to look at, you know, like my son's situation? This sounds like something we need to pull in some other teammates on. So if anything, it's like, let's take the pressure off of having to like get away from the feelings. Let's feel the feelings and know that that's normal. And then let's pull in some other professionals who might be able to help us figure this out, which is what we did in my son's case. You know, we had another wonderful adult who was at school who just did really allow him to talk about things. And ultimately, we addressed his safety and security, right? I don't know that we fixed the problem, but he felt supported and that was all he needed, right? So the last thing I want to talk about, so this is great. And for the school nurse, I think in that book, he talks about people just using these and having them available. I have printed them out and I put them by my kids' desks. Whether they look at them, it's again, it's in the passive environment, and I have a tool that's familiar for them that they can look at. So I think this is one of the, I just, a recent discovery of mine I'm finding has great utility. And then finally, oops, that's not the last slide. I will say, and this is why I think Study Pro is such a great resource for us, is that it's all about structure and strategy. So whether you do this in your house, you do this for yourself, you have a resource or use a coach, this idea that, you know, just sitting and being present is not enough. We do need to help to kind of organize attention, organize what work looks like, help our brains to be as effective as possible. So a lot of that is making sure we have the strategies, we talk about the strategies, we know the strategies, we're taking brain breaks, you know, we're sort of listening to what the body is telling us. And then we just have this positive mindset. You know, I think failure is something that we're sort of rebranding these days, hopefully, to be able to say, all right, well, that didn't go well. You didn't study for that test. You're not happy with that score. I hear that. What can we do next time? What do you think might help you feel a little bit better? My daughter just had a situation like this. Didn't get a test she liked. We sort of were able to, you know, feel it out. She went to talk to the teacher and she just feels better about it. You know, it's something where the more we talk about this and we show the our students and our children the way, I think it's really allows them to apply the same effort again. And remember, the frontal lobe loves that. You know, we get some dopamine, we found something that works, we'll do it again. So it's been so great talking to you guys about this. This topic is near and dear to my heart. I know there's some questions, so hopefully we can get to those. If you have any questions, though, I love to talk about this. I'll send you any resources you need. You can go to my website or just email me. And Debbie will make sure people have access to information. So thank you.
Yes.
I'm super excited to have been a part of this and start your webinar series off.
Thank you. And thank you for that Study Pro plug. It's funny, I'm looking at a picture of Study Pro and then sitting in Study Pro. I was like double vision, right? Which is really fantastic. And everybody is saying thank you. Wonderful information. Lauren, great talk. We can't underestimate the internal distractions that our kids and teens are coping with. And Suzanne, you were asking about what is the website again? I'm not sure. Obviously, you have Lauren's right here. I'm not sure which website you were asking about specifically. So maybe you can.
I'll show you the book that I was just talking about from an emotional regulation is Permission to Feel. Mark Brackett. This is the book I just read. I think it does hit nicely on sort of brain health, but and then in the front of his book, you have the mood meter, which of course in the slides too. You just Google mood meter. And then I did download, there's an app. There's a few apps. One is called How We Feel. I don't think it's their direct app, but it's related. But it's really pretty. And what it does is it essentially kind of prompts people to start tracking and collecting some data, which I think, you know, any type of cognitive behavioral therapy, we have to have some data points to be able to look at to say, is this a consistent problem? Is this a one off? What are we looking at here so we can better tackle it? So that app is very pretty. I think it's called How We Feel. You can find it in the App Store.
Well, I will look it up and find that and send all of that, the brief and the Permission to Feel website and everything else that we've talked about here today, and the link that Caroline provided, thanks to Alyssa Nettelstein, who we left too. So it is 10 o'clock, and I know that we got a few of the questions and comments in, so we really appreciate it. And I will just leave emphasizing one of the things that you said, which I thought was so incredibly important, which is you were talking about when your son was playing with the Legos and noticing the focus. One of the things that we talk about incessantly here in Love and stole from one of the psychologists that has worked or presented here before is Dr. Dalton, is this idea of watering the seeds. And we often are so anxious as parents to watch things grow like attention span that we water the weeds, and we notice all the time that they're not paying attention. And by noticing your son paying attention with Legos, you're allowing him to understand, well, what is it that I'm doing? And we all know it may be easier in a preferred activity than a non-preferred, but they're still having the chance to notice that they're doing things well, and recognizing that is something that's important. So we really are huge fans of that. And of course, everything else you said. And it was incredible to have you here. Such great, new, interesting information, understanding how attention works in the brain, the different types of attention, which I really loved that slide. And the slides will be sent along with the video recording. So thank you for spending your morning with us, everybody. We really appreciate it. And we will see you here for Dr. Navaldi next month. So we appreciate it. Thank you again, Lauren.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate everyone's attention today. And thank you so much.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.